Hello there. Today I'm tasting a wine from Hawkes Bay in New Zealand's North Island. So I have a bottle of Tony Bish's Fat and Sassy Chardonnay from the 2021 vintage. Tony Bish, I've made a video of one of his Chardonnays before, the Golden Egg at Easter. And he has quite a long history of making wine in New Zealand, starting out in the early 80s in Gisborne, working for one of the older wine companies here called Corban's. He moved on in 1986 to help the Mason brothers found Sacred Hill, one of the better known wineries in Hawkes Bay. He was there for a while. He then became the chief winemaker at Rippon down in Wanaka, famous winery there. Was there for a while. He started a winery in the South Canterbury region, I believe, but then in 1994 returned to Sacred Hill as their chief winemaker and stayed there for nearly 20 years. It wasn't until 2013 that he decided to branch out on his own and start his own brand, the Tony Bish brand. And obviously he decided he wanted to stick with what he liked and knew, and so he only makes Chardonnay these days. He's also very interested in egg-shaped fermenters, hence the Golden Egg and the Zen. This particular wine is simply made in barrels, and this is the entry-level wine in their range, or an entry-level wine from their range. But nonetheless, it's an interesting claim, fat and sassy. So the question is, perhaps, what makes a wine fat and what makes it sassy? I think maybe the sass is the place to start. It's a question of what do we mean by sassy? I mean, it's lively, it's energetic. Is it challenging? Is it you know, does it have a freshness? Is it invigorating? Does it stimulate you? I think that's a good way of looking at that. And that, I think, is coming from the fruit. And I think New Zealand Chardonnays are underrated. I know Kimya River, for instance, has gained quite a reputation worldwide in the last few years. But I think actually New Zealand's Chardonnays can have lovely fresh acidity, good rich flavours without being overblown, and yeah, they often present excellent value for money and well worth looking at. What makes a Chardonnay fat? I think a lot more of that is winemaking. Yes, growing it in a warm climate. I mean, for New Zealand, Hawkes Bay is a relatively warm region, so we're starting in the right place at any rate. But there's winemaking techniques you can use. I mean, barrel fermentation is one of those. So you're fermenting at a slightly higher temperature, which is going to give you a richer and more complex flavour and more texture as well. I suppose it depends on how much solid you leave in the juice. You'll get a very clean fermentation if you get very little solids, but if you don't settle the wine for particularly long, you can get a complex, rich amount of flavour as a result of that. What else? I mean, aging in barrel obviously will give barrel flavours. The more new oak, the smaller the oak, the more you can influence that. Putting the wine through malolactic conversion will soften the acidity, but also adds a sort of a richness in terms of the malolactic bacteria will create something called diacetyl, which can have quite a sort of a buttery, butterscotchy note that sort of lays over the flavours of oak and marries that quite nicely to the fruit flavours that you get in Chardonnay. So that can be a useful tool to round out the wine. And then finally, once you've fermented the wine and it's lying in barrel, aging, by keeping the yeast lees, the dead yeasts after fermentation that have fallen to the bottom of the barrel, by stirring those up and keeping them suspended, you can help slightly slow up the uptake of oak flavours, but also you're protecting the wine from oxidation, and as the yeasts break down, they're putting sugars and proteins into the wine, which is giving a richness, what the French would call gras, a richness, a roundness, a texture to the wine. So extended lees aging with regular lee stirring can all add fatness to a Chardonnay. So let's see if that's what's happened here. We know the wine is barrel fermented. So first thing to do, look at the colour. I'm quite impressed by how deep that is. There's almost heading towards a very pale gold. Looking at it, it's not particularly showing heavy tears. I mean, there are some flowing, but nothing particularly notable. The wine is only 13.5% alcohol, so actually for a Chardonnay, you'll often see Chardonnays at 14.5% if they're going to be very big. So maybe that's suggesting it's not as fat as all that. But let's have a look at the aromas. The aromas are lovely and rich and ripe, and they're very harmonious actually. The real sort of peachiness, a lifted note. I'm slightly surprised there seems to be a little bit of a banana aroma, which I would normally associate with cool fermentation and the production of esters, but maybe that's more of a sort of a ripe fruit banana note. And maybe that's some of actually the creaminess and the butterscotch notes that are coming out of that. There is some underlying vanilla and cedar notes from the oak, but they're very well integrated, and the combination of barrel fermentation and of lees suspension during aging will help to marry the fruit and the oak there. So that's, on the nose at any rate, very nicely integrated. So that's for taste. Initially there's a fresh, lively, energetic fruit, and actually that makes the front palate seem relatively lean, but it's lifting the fruit. The fruit is, there are lemony notes coming out above the butterscotch and butter notes that are coming to the front of the palate. There's a very tiny sort of vanilla cedar note, but it's all nicely integrated and almost a sort of slight cream caramel sort of notes to the mid palate. The alcohol is in balance, it doesn't seem particularly hot, and that sort of cream caramel and some lifted lemony citrus notes are coming out at the end to give it pretty good length. I mean, I don't want to overstate the wine. It's a well-made wine with some nice character. There are some slight, overlaying everything, there are actually some slight complexing notes of slightly sort of gunpowder, gunflint, those sort of notes that make me think that the portion of this may have been fermented with indigenous yeast, or may have been allowed to ferment with indigenous yeast, or possibly at the very least there's a reasonable retention of a high level of solids at some stage in some portion of the fermentation. I think there's enough oak to show that the barrel fermentation has had some relatively new oak in there, but like I say, it's well integrated. It's not smothered. Is this the fattest Chardonnay I've had? No, certainly not. I think within a spectrum of global Chardonnays, I think you'll find fatter Chardonnays from parts of California, and you'll see them with 14.5% alcohol, and that will help achieve that. In a Hawkes Bay context, yes, I think this is relatively rich and fruity. Is it sassy? Yes, I think it is. I think it's lively, it's exciting, it's challenging. It's also well balanced as well, which slightly contradicts that. But yes, there's an energy to the wine that's making me think there's it's invigorating, it's vigorous. The freshness of the acidity is lifting the fruit really nicely. So yes, Tony Bish's Fat and Sassy Chardonnay. I actually think that's a really nice, easy drink, very well made, mid-range Chardonnay. I'm liking the fact that the flavours are lasting so well, and there's some complexity left on the finish. So yes, thank you for watching. Maybe you'll buy that wine, but whatever, I hope you'll join us again. Bye now.